just a quick introduction about myself. So I work for Dell. I'm a 20 plus years of industry veteran. Started with call center, tech support in Dell way back in 2001. Okay, and so all the guys who are still in call center kind of background, don't worry, you have a solid future. Okay, but I can vouch for you that because there are a lot of things that you learn from that industry, right? It's all about mixing with different industries. So I've seen a ton of industries, like from a support background into engineering, and now I'm actually into tech pre-sales, basically kind of evangelism role. So this is me. Hit me up on LinkedIn. This is my profile. Feel free to connect. It's all about connectivity. So sorry, I'll pause here just in case you guys want to take a note of this. Us today have a hybrid cloud strategy. That's a huge number. A hybrid cloud, a majority of that 90% includes both hybrid cloud and multi-cloud, because multi-cloud is slowly but surely is the future right now. But if you look at out of that 90%, 80% of the organizations, and most of these organizations are bigger enterprises, a lot of the CSPs, MSPs out there, because their end customers want applications and data to remain on premises. So this is where the industry is kind of triggering. That's one part. Second, edge is exploding. Do you guys know what is the capacity of edge data that's going to be produced? So according to IDC, by 2025, 70% of the data growth is expected to be originated at the edge. Mind-boggling numbers. We haven't even thought of by 2025, so we're almost close by, another 3 years. So why edge is exploding? Because if you look at manufacturing, if you look at, nobody wants to have a latency of coming back to the cloud or to the centralized data center, then come back and the data gets processed. There is so much of latency before an action is taken. Think about traffic signal, for example, right? Very straightforward. Even if you have to kind of assess the situation, you do image inferencing on the road, on the street, and say, hey, this is the density of the traffic, and the data has to go back and that process and then come back to form, hey, you know what, this is a green signal, or a wait signal, or a go, or a stop signal, right? That takes time, right? There's no scope for wait there. That's why the data has to be processed locally. And that's why edges is the future, period, right? If you look at all of the customers today, they're looking at how do I not only just rely on my centralized data center, but also look at growing my edge locations. That's where they can mitigate all of these latency issues. Again, coming back to, this is not for all organizations, right? Organizations planning or have a mandate that the data and the applications has to remain on premises because they need to meet certain particular regulations, and somebody rightly pointed out, compliance and so on. Okay, any questions so far? I know this AKS and this guy is talking about data sovereignty and all this stuff, but very relevant before even I pitch in why AKS on Azure Stack HCI. Okay, any questions here? So my gist of the topic today is, the agenda of the topic today is, now AKS we all know, so as customers today are trying to repatriate some of the workloads from public cloud, they are used to the cloud operating model. Now, the moment they're thinking about on-premises infrastructure, they're like, oh my God, I have to manage my infrastructure, I have to monitor. There's so much of nitty-gritties of managing the whole asset, right? Now, this is one part of it, right? And the second part of it is, most of these applications are not modernized. They are monolithic applications which are running on legacy virtualization. I have met customers in Malaysia who are running applications on Windows Server 2003, would you believe it? They haven't upgraded. It's end of support, end of life, you name it, end of everything, right? But they haven't done anything about it because ain't broken, don't fix it. So it just works for them, so they're happy. So there are a ton of these customers who are aspiring to kind of modernize, but they don't know how to do it. This is exactly why I'm going to be talking about why bring application modernization to on-premises, not just application modernization. With Azure Stack HCI, you will also be able to modernize your infrastructure, because without modernizing the infrastructure, you won't be able to modernize your applications, right? Your scalability, how does the scalability come? Anything that we all talk about, for example, elastic if you guys have attended session with Elastic, right? It's a scalable architecture completely, right? Now, if you have to run that similar instance on premises on a traditional set of servers, it's going to be a disaster, right? So how do you get the same elasticity kind of a model on premises? That's exactly what Azure Stack HCI is. What is HCI? Any guesses? Super. Hyper-converged. What is hyper-converged infrastructure? Yes. Yes. So it's collapsed into a single unit, right? It's abstracted. So what's the big deal about it? What is the most important word? Exactly, software defined. We are living in a world of software defined. Everything is software controlled. Everything is automated by software. In the typical world of the data centers, where you had compute, storage, and network separately, you had to hire 3 different skill sets to manage 3 different stacks. And if you had to kind of expand your footprint, right, nobody knows that whether your compute is going to work with storage or your compute is going to work with network. There is so much of discretion, right, between the 3 layers. So this is where HCI is really playing the winner here, right? Which means all that abstraction is done by the software layer today, and then so it's automated, so that it becomes that much more easier. All right, so I wanted to kind of set the context. I know we are running really short on time, but this is very, very important for you guys to understand before even I talk about AKS on Azure Stack HCI. So the gist of the session is going to be, how do I even modernize and bring up Azure Stack HCI? Okay, so I think we already covered what is Azure Stack HCI. AKS on Azure Stack HCI, that's something that we'll look at it. It's going to be a demo heavy session. So you will, instead of just talking about slides, I will show you how it is actually being deployed. How does Azure Stack HCI look like? What does it have to do with public Azure? All of that you will get to see. All right, now, so you will see setting up the AKS on Azure Stack HCI, and you'll also see modernizing the applications using Kubernetes, AKS, right? Deploying data services. Now, how many of you have used SQL MI, SQL managed instance in public Azure, right? Why do customers want to use SQL MI in public Azure? Scalability, and any other thoughts? Manageability, and it's evergreen. You don't need licensing, right? You don't need underlying hardware. So you don't have to install the operating system and manage that operating system, which is actually hosting that SQL server on top of it, right? So there is so much of hassle a customer would actually, divide out of just running SQL. All he needs to do is spin up a SQL instance. It's managed by Microsoft. Every underlying infrastructure is, because it's a PaaS, platform as a service, right? All I need to do is, consume the storage or consume the DB. Simple, right? So just like that, what if I get the same experience on premises? That's exactly what Microsoft is trying to do, right? So we're going to look at that as well. And last but not least, we'll have Q&A, but I don't want to keep Q&A to the end. If you have any questions, say, Jayanth, stop. You can feel free to kind of, ask me the question, right? All right, any questions so far before we proceed? Great. Okay, now, so under the Microsoft Hybrid Cloud, right? So this is Microsoft Hybrid Cloud today is by far the most matured hybrid cloud space out there, right? Nobody has, been able to kind of identify the hybrid cloud opportunity like Microsoft did. Now, why do you think is one of the reasons for it, right? The reason is Microsoft was actually born in the enterprise. Unlike most of the AWS, for instance, or GCP, they were actually born in the cloud mostly, right? They have already thought about modernization long time back. But Microsoft was there long time back trying to, Windows Server, trying to install it on a bare metal server. Customers were trying to identify how to hook it up, all of that, right? 3-tier SAN, I think you must be familiar with, right? So this is all something that Microsoft was already there. So Azure was an afterthought. So they had one of the best learnings, not just the learnings, Probably Microsoft has the richest partner ecosystem out there compared to any other hyperscalers. With that, because with the kind of tie-up which they have with all these partners, it makes them easier to penetrate into all of these organizations who are trying to look at, hey, I need hybrid cloud story, right? This is exactly where it fits in. So under that, they have 3 distinct products. Don't get confused. Azure Stack Hub is one product where it brings all Azure services. Well, don't hold me there. It's not all. It's a subset of Azure services to on-premises. Okay? Now, what is a big deal? Let's say, for instance, I have a customer, like, and I'm not sure if you've heard of customers like Halliburton, Schlumberger's of the world. They're like mostly into oil rigs, application management, monitoring of oil rigs, right? So they have a huge application which is developed in public Azure. Now, what they're trying to do is, for example, they come to India and ONGC is their next customer. All of you know ONGC? Right. ONGC is their customer. ONGC will say, sorry, data cannot go to the public cloud. It has to remain on premises. Now, Halliburton is in a fix. Now, how do I re-architect my application which is actually working in public Azure to on premises, right? So the solution which they have is Azure Stack Hub. So what it does is brings the same Azure services to on premises. Now, Halliburton does not have to re-architect their application, deploy as is, get up and running. So the end customer is met with the regulatory needs, good, or everybody good. Now, Azure Stack HCI. Azure Stack HCI, like somebody said, Hyper-V, right? Hyper-V is something that every customer is using today. So 30% of the organizations today are using Hyper-V, and remaining probably is, I would say fairly VMware, right? Most of us are familiar with VMware. Now, out of those customers, they don't want a 3-tier SAN, but they want a hyper-converged infrastructure using the Microsoft solution, right? Now, how do they build that? That's exactly what Azure Stack HCI is. So Azure Stack HCI is now delivered as an Azure service, right? Which can not only modernize your aging infrastructure, but it has a very tight integration with public Azure. So you will see when I say what is that integration, just park that word in your mind. When I say integration, strong integration with Azure, you will see how that integration actually works. Now, Azure Stack Edge is a product which is, I would say, a disaster. Okay, Microsoft hasn't sold a ton, many of that. They tried a lot of things. Somehow it didn't click, right? So what it does is basically the image inferencing and video inferencing kind of use cases and IoT data processing. How many of you are familiar with Databox Edge? Azure had Databox Edge. So what they used to do is they carry the data from the edge locations, take it back to the centralized location, upload it to Azure, and process that data in Azure, right? That's exactly, it's a dumb box, right? What they're trying to do right now is build a little more intelligence. They have some applications which are running on this box right now, which can do basic image inferencing and video inferencing and IoT processing. Those kind of services can be run on that edge appliance today. Okay, it hasn't clicked because of Azure Stack HCI popularity. It's kind of stepping onto the edge because it can do much more than what Edge does today. Okay, all right. Now look at this. This is portal.azure.com. As I said, Azure Stack HCI is actually a service. You can just look it up as well. It is actually a service that's available in Azure. So which means when you spin up or modernize your infrastructure using Hyper-V or Azure Stack HCI, and then you register that cluster against an Azure subscription, it gets registered against this particular, for example, in that subscription which I'm using, it gets registered here. So when I go into Azure Stack HCI, I'll show you. All right, so now the best part is, right, now, how do I have modernized my infrastructure. Now the next step is to now modernize my infrastructure, modernize my applications, which is very, very key, right? Today, if customers are not in the modernization journey, they're going to be left behind. So I tell this customers, right, if you're not modernizing, your competitor is modernizing. So think about it. You don't have a choice today. Customers don't have a choice of laid back attitude. Oh, chalta yaar, I will see when the time comes. No, sorry. The startups are disrupting the way you function today, right? It's no more, the big ones eating small. It's about the smaller ones challenging the big ones, right? That's what is happening because of modernization. Everybody is getting onto the modernization journey. Now, as customers are trying to modernize their applications, they need a solid platform. So what if I told you AKS now, you can bring the native Azure AKS services that actually runs in public Azure, you get the same experience, deploy it on Azure Stack HCI as is, right? All right, so just a quick one about how does the overall thing look like, right? What is the architecture looking like? If you look at the overall architecture of Azure Stack HCI, so this is where the Azure Stack HCI underlying infrastructure is, right? This is where you have a bunch of hardware, like the servers, which is hyper-converged. They're not just bare metal dumb boxes, right? They're actually hyper-converged infrastructure. They're much more intelligent, right? So this is what actually drives the upper layers, right? So as you see, Linux and Windows containers. So on top of Azure Stack HCI, so Azure Stack HCI creates that virtualization layer, right? And now me as a customer, because I have Azure Stack HCI, which is software defined, it makes my job easier to manage this infrastructure, which customers had a lot of apprehensions on, right? Customers' apprehensions were, I don't want to manage, I don't want to get into the business of IT. Well, you don't have to, because we are giving you an automated infrastructure, right? Which is self-sufficient. If there is a problem, it will report back to either Dell or Microsoft, and we exactly know what the issue is. Instead of you calling us, we will call you and say, this is the problem, and we are sending out your technician. How about that, right? That's really a cloud, bringing a cloud operating model to on-premise. That's actually cloud operating model, okay? Now with that, so what Microsoft did to bring AKS as is on Azure Stack HCI, they had to kind of do a little bit of tweaking around just to make sure that AKS works on Azure Stack HCI. One of the greatest thing which they did was CSI and CNI. How many of you know CSI, CNI? So CSI is container storage interface. CNI is container network interface, okay? So basically, for containers to orchestrate seamlessly, you need the underlying storage layer, and also you need the underlying network layer to be automated. So to make sure that it actually orchestrates. See, container orchestration is the biggest challenge today, right? See, we all talk about containers, but when you talk about containers at scale, like thousands of containers deployed, right? They are all looking at each container pod is looking at an IP address, right? You don't want to kind of have an overlapping IP and then a network congestion, right? So all has to be managed. So this is where the intelligence of building that API provider for network and storage is very critical as AKS is deployed on Azure Stack HCI, okay? Now, the best part about AKS, as we all know, is Microsoft is trying to build on top of the open source code through Kubernetes, right? Everybody, so Google outsourced Kubernetes way back in 2014. Project Borg, if you remember, it was called before that, right? So they outsourced that to the community freely in 2014. That's when the whole industry grabbed it, right? AKS, AWS has EKS and EKS anywhere today, right? GKE, for instance, Google has their own cloud. And Rancher, there are so many container distributions out there, right? So just like that, but today AKS is the third most popular container distributions out there, if you're not familiar. OpenShift by far is the #1, Red Hat OpenShift, right? So now what they're trying to do is, what the industry is doing towards Kubernetes, AKS does not want to be left behind. We want to make sure that we align with what the industry is doing. That's why they're actually leveraging on the Kubernetes platform as such, and they're modernizing that based on that platform, right? So it's like as seamless as possible. What the industry is doing, AKS is also doing. Now, how many of you have heard about Azure Arc? Excellent, 3 guys. Any idea what Azure Arc is? Okay, very synonymous with multi-cloud. Okay, is it just multi-cloud? Yes. So, yeah, sorry, go ahead. Well, yeah, exactly. Now, why do you think Azure Arc should exist? What is the biggest use case of Azure Arc? Huh? It's not latency, because I'll tell you why. The infrastructure and data is actually running on premises. So there's no question of latency at all. But Arc does not do movement of data, right? Arc is only managing the infrastructure. On-prem infrastructure also. So yes, you can, but again, what's the biggest use case for a customer? What is it trying to solve? It basically, what it does is single pane of glass. Very beautiful word, we love hearing that. Single pane of glass, right? We all love that. I don't know how Americans come up with these kind of technology, this terminology. If there is one that they're good at, coming up with all these fancy names. Superb, okay? So yeah, one single pane of glass. So every organization today wants to have a single pane of glass, okay, experience, while they're managing assets in public Azure, they're also managing the similar assets on premises or edge or you name it, IoTs, you name it, right, from a single control plane. What a beautiful thing. I'll give you a single example of this use case. I have 1,000 virtual machines running in public Azure. I have 2,000 virtual machines running on premises, and some of them are running in different public clouds, okay? But from an IT perspective, from a compliance perspective, from a policy perspective, every virtual machine needs to have a particular version of the antivirus running. How do I ensure that? Just think about, just wear your shoes on IT personnel and think, how does this guy is going to manage this, right? Mind-boggling. It's impossible to manage. Now that's where Azure Policies comes in, right? All of us know Azure Policies. With Azure Policies, exactly it tells me what is the current state of all my virtual machines, irrespective of where it resides, right? Now I get a holistic view of all VMs and say compliance remediation, okay? Here is what it's not complying. It is not running a particular version of antivirus that you want your organization to run. So all of this is now bubbled up, and customer, as an IT admin, he gets a holistic view. It's so much easier, right? That's exactly what Azure Arc is trying to do, okay? All right, now, so Azure Hybrid Stack with AKS, right? This is the beautiful thing. Now, we talked about modernizing the infrastructure using Azure Stack HCI. Then we talked about modernizing your applications using AKS. That means you bring AKS and then build containerized applications. So it's scalable architecture and easier to update and all of that, elastic in nature, all of that, great, right? So that's why containers are. Now, what if I told you some customers are interested in native Azure services? Like for instance, we talked about SQL managed instance. I want to get a similar experience of SQL MI that's running in public Azure, but it needs to come on-prem, right? I need an Azure function which is available today as a serverless computing, which is available today as a service in public Azure. I want Azure functions on premises. Well, customer is asking too much, right? How do you get all that? All of that is actually made possible through AKS. How? Because all of these services are containerized services today. Now, all I need is a container platform that actually can run these services. As simple as that, right? So they didn't have to reinvent anything, right? Everything was there. All that they need to do is, okay, thank you. So all that they need to do was make sure that it was, it was made available for on-premise as well. So that's exactly what this thing is, right? You are able to not only manage your virtual machines as is, because like I said, not many customers are ready for the transformation journey. They're still running on 2003, Windows Server. I mean, can you imagine? Some customer, I was like, how they had 2,000 servers of Windows 2003. This is one of the customers in Malaysia. They were running and they were thinking about, sir, are you not looking to modernize? Oh, no. Everything is working fine, right? But the thing is, they're going to be left behind very soon, right? They're already left behind, but that's the thing. But now they're thinking about modernization. So, but they can as is run the same VMs. Not only that, they can also start modernizing. So it's the best of both worlds, right? Not only do you have the latest and the greatest hardware in terms of innovation and all of that, but you also have the best of lift and shift experience, which means your legacy infrastructure, which can come and park itself onto a modernized underlying infrastructure. And then at a later point of time, I can think about modernizing my applications also. How beautiful is that, right? So this is exactly where the enterprises today are looking at, right? They need that breathing space so that they can lift and shift and then think about modernization at the later point of time. Okay, so that's where the, if the customer is like modernization savvy, they can think about, ArcML services that's available, app services, and then, the Azure functions and all of that. That is made available. Since I said most of these are container-based services, it's easier to deploy it on AKS. Okay? All right, so with that, I think let's get started with the, okay, now, let me this. Okay. All right, so okay, so this is actually, how many of you have seen Windows Admin Center? So Windows, yeah, great. Windows Admin Center is a de facto tool to manage the Azure Stack HCI cluster. How many of you are familiar with SCVMM? System Center products, System Center configuration, yeah. So it's a next version of, basically System Center was used for managing the 3-tier architecture, but right now it's actually used, the Windows Admin Center is now a browser-based tool which you can use to manage your Azure Stack HCI clusters. So now within the Windows Admin Center, you have Azure Kubernetes Service. Right? Now, so beautiful. Now, all I need to do is not only am I just managing and spinning up virtual machines, I'm also spinning up an AKS instance. So that's, okay, so let's see. It's stuck there. Oops. 1 second, sorry. Yeah, this is the problem with recorded demos. Okay, yeah, it's going on. So what you do is you're actually trying to install AKS on Azure Stack HCI. That's what it's trying to do. And you provide your user credential, which is a cluster credentials, right? Remember, this is hosted on premises, right? With just a couple of nodes. And then it's checking all the prerequisites. This is the same experience one would get when they actually deploy AKS in public Azure. Okay, it's just that you don't have to deploy Azure Stack HCI, it's just that because it's already there. But considering that in this case, Azure Stack HCI is already deployed, and now you're actually deploying an AKS on Azure Stack HCI cluster. So like I said, virtual IP, this is your on-premises network, right? Where you're actually trying to lease out the IPs for the pods, because you're going to spin up more and more pods, right? So you're going to give an IP pool to make sure that, it fetches those IP addresses. So this is where it's very easy again, right? You lease out the IP addressing in your DHCP server, and it exactly knows what to do and all those stuff. So you see this, right? This is a very interesting thing. It's actually trying to register to public Azure. This is exactly what I said, Arc. Now, coming back to the same thing, right? What if, it's running AKS on premises, but at the same time, I want to manage this AKS from public Azure. That's why it needs to integrate. That's why it asked me for a subscription ID and my resource group, all of that information, right? So when I do register and say create a cluster, it'll automatically get registered with public Azure. But don't make a mistake. This AKS doesn't go to public Azure. No, AKS will continue to run on Azure Stack HCI. It's just that it is surfaced into Azure. That means from Azure, I'm able to manage this cluster. So manage does not mean migration, no, right? Manage means I know exactly what is the state of my cluster, what is the health of my cluster and all of that, okay? Now, once the AKS service is set up, you need to create a cluster, like 2-node cluster or 3-node cluster, whatever it is, right? That's where the nodes, most of you are familiar with Kubernetes nodes, right? So Kubernetes nodes is what actually hosts containers and pods and containers, right? So that's what it is. Now, what we are trying to do right now here is to create a cluster, right? So we'll go to the next screen. So what we are trying to do is now create a cluster. So let's click next. All right. So again, the same. You see this Azure Arc integration. So this is where I create. So one of the goodness about AKS is it supports both Windows containers and Linux containers. Right? So one of the few container distributions out there which supports both Windows, because no matter how much you say Kubernetes, 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 but still the underlying architecture, the kernel that runs Kubernetes on top of is also important. So the underlying kernel that's actually hosting the Kubernetes is also very, very important. Either it's a Windows kernel or a Linux kernel. That's why some containers are built on Windows kernel, some containers are built on Linux kernel. Well, the Linux kernel offshoots the Windows containers by a big margin. That's a different story. That's where what Microsoft did is actually they had an operating system built on Linux. How many of you know Microsoft builds Linux operating system? Yes, it's called Mariner OS. Okay, so it's a Linux distribution, but they have remodified that into it's called Mariner. So that's exactly what this container, the underlying architecture is, right? Now you can select whether you want to connect with Azure Active Directory. You see, that's exactly what I meant. Azure Stack HCI is hybrid in nature. That means it has a very strong connectivity with public Azure, right? That's why you see all these registrations, the ability to pull up resource groups from public Azure and say, where do you want this resource to reside? Well, although technically the resource doesn't reside there, but it has a point reference there, that's all. Okay. Now you see the AKS is now set up. So that means a single node, in this case I've just given an example of single node Linux node where it actually set up that cluster for you. Okay. So as you can see this, if you go into public Azure, you see all of these things, right? Now the cluster is actually created. Now look at this. This is a familiar thing for a developer. The moment the developer sees this, he's like, wow, I am feeling at home. I don't care about what the underlying infrastructure is because it doesn't bother to him, right? All he is worried about is GitOps, right? He feels home. So see this, now you're getting the gist of it, right? So the intent and the essence of what Microsoft is trying to deliver is to get the same public Azure experience to on-premises, right? And now you see the GitOps experience, right? So we saw how you can, so one of the customers, this is a real-time use case, okay? One of the customers in Australia, they had 2,000 stores, one of the biggest retail giants in the world, top 10 in the world, okay? They're called Coles. I'm not sure if anybody know. Coles Retail. So they're in Australia, they have 2,000 stores, 2,000 stores. We have helped them modernize all the 2,000 stores, deploying single instance, in some stores like single instance of Azure Stack HCI, and in some cases there are two nodes of Azure Stack HCI, and it's up and running, and they're modernized their applications. Now all they need to do is make a code change in GitHub, commit those code changes in GitHub, automatically the containers are deployed on all of these 2,000 stores. Think about it, right? That is the real use of modernization. Now, if they had to modernize this in a legacy way, it would have probably taken 10 years for them. 2,000 stores I'm talking about, right? And not only that, it gives them always uptime data because they can stay relevant with AKS on public Azure. When AKS gets updated in public Azure, AKS also gets updated on premises as well. So they're always to the latest and greatest. Not just that, they're also reaping all the benefits of true hybrid, right? So that's exactly what we're trying to do. Sorry, how much time do we have? Okay, all right. All right, so I think that's exactly what it is, right? So now I'll go back to this demo where we talked about deploying, modernizing applications. Now we are talking about SQL managed instance, right? So you see this. Now all I need to do is go into Azure Arc, right? And then go into, you see all these options here, right? It's all under Azure Arc. And these can run on premises, right? And now this is a cluster which is created, which is Azure Stack HCI 2-node cluster on Hyper-V, running on Hyper-V, and it's actually showing up here in public Azure. That's exactly what Azure Arc is. So it's a service. Now I'm not only able to manage all of this. See, even I have Windows Admin Center right here. So I don't even have to go to my laptop and open Windows Admin Center. All I need to do is click Windows Admin Center right now in public preview. But think about the power. Single pane of glass, right? It's not just talk about it, but make the customers feel and experience. That's exactly what Microsoft is trying to do, right? And you can manage, using Azure Arc, you can manage all of this. Be it a single server, bare metal server, manage it. Postgres hyperscale, manage it. Web applications, all of that can be seamlessly managed from on-premises through Azure, right? So that's exactly what it's trying to do. Now, so this, I'm trying to create a SQL managed instance. So you see this, right? I am trying to deploy a SQL managed instance from public Azure, but the SQL data control plane will actually go and deploy it on-premises on Azure Stack HCI cluster. Magical. So this is the power of hybrid, right? That is a true power of hybrid. That's exactly what customers want today. When I show this to customers, they're like, wait a minute, can you rewind this back and play me again? Because they're like magical. They haven't even thought about it, right? I could do something like this, and it saves not only my IT hours, but it saves me from managing that underlying operating system which is actually hosting this SQL managed instance, right? So this is some, basically it'll tell you even the costing, because when you say, just don't say cloud operating model on-prem, but even the costing needs to be pay as you go, right? You consume for what you pay. That's what you do in public Azure. So same thing holds true even for HCI as well, right? So I'm trying to create, just give all the details and then create and be done with it, right? Thank you.